My vox returned my litany of unsealing 7/10 of a second before my lips formed the first syllable. The words came back to me in my own timbre, stripped of breath but stamped with my vocal metrics, a perfect anticipatory echo moving ahead of me through the dark. It should have been lag, never led. Machine spirits are patient. They do not run before their masters. We were 6 descending K-theta spiral toward the Noctis fringe, beneath Tharsis Magna, into a vault that had not been opened since the Treaty of 9 Gates. Inquisitor Helion Rauk walked point beneath a halo of rusted emergency lamps, his augmetic fingers drumming against his bolt pistol's grip, in rhythm with something none of us had named yet. The Skitarii Primus. Barca managed the sentry that was not here, his remaining file of 4 moving in staggered watch along the gantries, augmetic heels biting sparks from catwalk teeth. I carried the seals and the sin of curiosity, Magos biologis errant Seraphel Cade, oath-bound adjunct to the Ordo Machinum, my robe's hem gathering Mars in red fronds. The air should have been bone-dry, a desiccant that kept sanctum metal clear of oxidation for millennia. Instead, the collar corridor's breath clung to my face like wet gauze, humid, 58% by my dermal sensors, and faintly warm. I tasted copper and old parchment, the flavour of prayers left too long in damp places. The vent fans that should have laid their clean, predictable thrum through the superstructure were silent. It is difficult to measure an absence until it presses on the drum of the ear, and then it becomes weight. A 5-tone chime threaded the noosphere like a prayer faintly remembered, tones 3, 1, 4, 1, 5, repeating in a loop that matched no forges I knew. My chronometer marked each repetition, every 47 seconds, precise as a heartbeat. The sound seemed to emerge from the walls themselves, vibrating through ceramite and plasteel with harmonics that made my teeth ache. Rauk's voice came through my cranial pickups as a cold blade. "Log the anomaly, Seraphel. Keep it clinical." "Logged," I answered, though there was a slip, a present tense shiver to the word. I did not like that my mouth had to catch up to my own record. We paused at a junction marker where the bulkhead plaque had blistered under decades of dust storms half a world away, but the sigils beneath the grime were precise. A non-Aegon rune wheel, 9 strokes scribing 9 paths, the old Martian glyph for the 9th seal. Someone, long ago or a moment ago, had etched the catechism beneath. Flesh is weak. Under certain angles, the second word flickered, the oxidized ferric catching my augmetic's low light and bending it. Weak became key for the length of my blink. "Motion?" Rauk asked. "Negative," Barca said, and then corrected himself in a tone that did not like imprecision. Correction. Residual heat tracks moving counter to air gradient, mid-pressure, uphill, like warmth drawn by a pump. That was wrong. Heat did not climb toward deeper cold unless moved. The walls around us wept red condensation, ferric oxide mixed with moisture that should not exist in these depths. Each droplet caught the lumens of our photovisors, creating patterns that resembled scripture when the light hit them correctly. I found myself reading fragments of that same phrase etched in the condensation trails, though the letters seemed to shimmer and change when I looked directly at them. We passed niches full of cherub servitors, mummified, waxen, mouths sewn with copper wire. They hung like votive offerings, with their tiny hands folded, and their wings had been stripped down to bare rod and rag, each feather pinned beneath with a holy nail. Their glass eyes had fogged, but every 6th face wore a cracked smile as if someone had tried to pry the wire out from within. One cherub's chest rose and fell in a breathing rhythm that no servitor should possess, its eyes tracking our movement with organic fluidity. A scrap code mote ticked against my noospheric firewall, a single binary NAT with no payload. I brushed it aside and it did not fall. It unhappened. There was nothing to record because there had been nothing, and yet my log held the movement of my defense, not the cause. Static arcs crawled across my Auspex display like ghostly sinew, forming brief geometric shapes before dissipating into digital shadow. We found the first sign of the missing at a turning where K-theta collapsed into meatless geometry. The floor plates shifted their edging so that the 90-degree seam composed an extra sliver of angle, a ninth fraction that did not fit Euclid. Barker's optics stuttered, correcting, and then he untilted his head the way a predator corrects for a prey's trick. "Footfalls," he said. He put the image into our eyes. Grieve, prints descending in perfect discipline, dilation at the heel where they'd paused to listen, then a halt on the threshold of the next door. The prints continued into the bulkhead only insofar as the bulkhead had ceased to be bulkhead. Ceramite had flowed in a ripple and set in a texture my wetware kept naming cartilage and then renaming wave-stiffened steel as if embarrassed. The door waited ahead, its surface marked with rust velvet corruption that rippled as we approached. Ceramite flowing like living tissue, responding to our presence without any vocal command. The portal showed no signs of forced entry, yet the missing Skitaris prints terminated at its base as if they had simply walked through solid matter. I lifted my mechadendrite and traced the seam. The metal warmed under the prayer in my thoughts. I did not speak. I did not dare. The seam parted anyway with the tactility of an incision pulling, edges relaxing by degrees, as if sutures popped beneath unseen fingers. The opening released a smell like hospitals in summer and the inside of a drone's casing when it has worked too long. Sweet, iron, hot plastic. "Record that I did not give command," Rauch said, his voice carrying the weight of Ordo Machinum authority. "Record that it answered." "Recorded," I said, and my voice had already said it before me, the word echoing from my Vox grill in perfect anticipation of my intent. We entered through the rust velvet mouth and the door closed behind us with a sigh that did not belong to pressure. It sealed flush with peristaltic motion, bulkhead rippling into cartilage-like swells. There was no lock. There were only reusable edges and a will to hold. The corridor beyond sloped down, carved by tools that knew the difference between a wedge and a blade, and chose both. Its floor tiles held the non-ergon stamper's mark on every other plate, rotated such that you could walk a perfect figure 9 if you left foot on symbol and right foot on blank. The 5-tone chime slowed, not in timekeeping but in attention, as if it wanted to hear us more closely. My pulse slid into time with it despite myself, and then pulled away as I scolded it. I do not consider my flesh part of myself unless it behaves. "Conclave deadline?" Rauch asked. 22 hours, 41 minutes, I said. "Storm shutters at 78%. Prediction, full seal in 5 hours. "Plenty," he lied. I began the litany of unsealing again, low, to mark our passage deeper into the vault, and my Vox returned the words before my teeth touched consonant. But this time, there was something else. A second voice joined to mine, still my own cadence but pitched a half-tone lower, a body double-born of circuitry and attention. The prayer unrolled like a scroll into the noosphere in harmonics I had never learned, speaking words in my own voice that I had never heard before. The prayer I had not yet learned echoed through the humid darkness ahead of us, naming things I did not recognize in a tongue that felt like coming home. Somewhere in the depths beyond, something old and patient, something that had been waiting for us to be polite, moved to let us in. The prayer I had not yet learned echoed through the humid darkness ahead of us, naming things I did not recognize in a tongue that felt like coming home. We committed to the descent, our boots finding purchase on tiles that should have been slick with Martian dust, but instead gripped our soles with the tackiness of drying blood. The corridor received the unlearned prayer like a familiar tool sliding into a prepared hand, the air pressing in warmer, humidity climbing another degree on my dermal readout as the 5-tone chime softened to a nearer source. Barker's Auspex swept ahead, painting thermal returns that sketched impossible physics in clean, damning data. Heat signatures moved counter to airflow. Warmth, drawn uphill by some mechanism that violated every thermodynamic principle the Omnissiah had blessed us to understand. The red condensation had thickened into proper weeping, ferric tears streaming down ceramite faces in patterns that resembled flowing Martian script. My sampling mechadendrite tasted the moisture. Iron oxide threaded through with proteins that should not exist in a sealed vault. Hemoglobin analogues, cellular fragments, the chemical signature of something that had once been alive and was now dissolved into the very walls. Atmospheric composition anomaly, I reported through cranial pickup, my voice going ahead of me by that same treacherous fraction. Humidity at 62% and climbing. Trace organics present in wall secretions. This violates the thermic ordinance. The floor's grit should have squealed dry beneath our passage. Instead, there was a tack to it, a faint adhesion like walking through syrup that had set, but not hardened. Static arcs crawled across my Auspex display like ghostly sinew, each spark forming brief geometric shapes. Nonagon fragments, 9-pointed stars, before dissolving into digital shadow. Scrap code motes fluttered through my noospheric periphery, like gnats made of corrupted data, each carrying fragments of binary that resembled prayer code, but dissolved when examined directly. The servo niches along the corridor walls housed cherub servitors in states of unnatural preservation, their waxen faces bearing expressions of mute suffering, lips cracked and sealed with copper wire oxidized to green tears. But their glass eyes tracked our movement with organic fluidity, and one cherub's chest continued its impossible breathing rhythm, ribs expanding and contracting beneath preservation shrouds in cadence with the 5-tone chime. We passed another plaque where flesh is weak had been overstruck 9 times with mechanical precision, each strike cutting through oxide into bright metal. Beneath the violence of correction, in a finer hand, someone had scraped, "Flesh is key." The letters malformed, as if the hand that made them had been learning to write for the first time. The passage opened onto a manufacturum bay, whose lights pulsed with low, red-gold warmth like banked forge coals. It was not illumination. It was heat made visible. The STC limb fabricator dominated the room, its feed hoppers full of red dust and machine oil, augers turning with a sound like teeth grinding in sleep. The extruder head lowered over an altar bed of textured plasteel scored with drainage channels stained dark as old blood. The fabber moved with grace unusual to its class. Red dust, common Martian iron that usually yielded only to flame and caustic, drew together under thin beads of oil and became something wet. It extruded in slow ribbons that should have been polymer but were not. Muscle, pink and striated, laced with fine capillaries that ran clear until a pulse shuddered through them and coloured them crimson. The ribbons fell onto the altar with wet sounds, adhering and twitching as if making space among other tissues the machine had laid in earlier hours. A servo skull floated from behind the fabricator, its thrusters struggling in the thickening air, Voxbox muttering, "Ave Mechanicus Ave" in ruined whispers. Its jaw was wrong. Someone had soldered it closed, and then the seal had softened, metal edge receding, as bone crept to meet it. The skull turned toward us, Vox crackling, and a wet tendril flowered from the grill, pink and tentative, tasting the air with newborn greed. It formed curls and flicks, as if learning to pronounce vowels, and when the voice came, it was my own earlier echo trying a new mouth. The 5-tone chime slowed to make room for a 9th beat I felt in my palatine screws and throat bracing. My laryngeal augmetics hummed in sympathetic resonance they should not have known. Environmental readings spiked. Humidity at 64%, core temperature rising to human warmth, atmospheric pressure fluctuating in rhythm, with something vast and patient breathing beneath us. I approached the control lectern where brass and bone inlay had been overlaid with strips of polymer mag tape encoded in compressed binharic. Protein sequence notation rode alongside machine code like flesh script glossing sacred binary. When my mechadendrite touched the tape, it flexed with animal recoil, not plastic, but something cured to horn hardness, then warmed by the room's body until it remembered being soft. Under the fabricator's bed, Heat signatures pulsed with cardiac regularity. The chamber exhaled on every fifth tone and inhaled on the ghost ninth, the pattern walking through my fingertips as cold then heat. Nonagon mold frames arrayed around the central assembly held half-formed shapes glistening with recent extrusion. Organs, muscle sections, bone fragments, laid in precise nine-pointed star configuration. Rauch's mechadendrites stiffened, each sensing heat like serpents. He made a cutting gesture, and our unit band died to hard silence, tapping his rosette with a knuckle that should have sounded tinny, but came viscous, as if the air held onto sound and changed it. Authority, Barca signed with his left hand, while his right tightened on his carbine without conscious permission. Quarantine protocol, Rauch signed back, a slash across the wrist. Not yet. The extruder ratcheted down with mechanical grace and set its snout over a narrow die whose geometry was obscene only because it was correct. A tongue mold, complete with the long axis ridge where language sits, and smaller depressions where piercing studs anchor for those who enjoy metal inside meat. The machine laid down a thin gloss of oil, and the tongue appeared, extruded as translucent ribbon that blushed through with blood as it cooled. It set into the die with decisive shiver, absurdly clean and perfect, the tip carving a question mark in air as if tasting for a mouth to belong to. 2/3 back along the dorsum, a vacancy for a stud. The stud was already there, printed as curved ceramite spicule. I knew that stud, the wear on one edge, the tiny notch where a drill had skipped and been corrected. I knew my colleagues' modifications with the attention I granted relics. Rauch's augmetic hand rose to his throat, flesh knuckles whitening as his pupils contracted to pinholes then widened, meeting the chamber's breathing rhythm. The fabricated tongue twitched in a way that would have been laughter if there had been lungs to push it. The servo skull's budding tongue formed my name with curl and tap, Seraphel, while its vox whispered the sound as file note and confession. The 5 tones resolved into expectancy. The 9th waited. Rauch looked at me, then at the machine that had learned his most intimate augmentation. He opened his mouth, and the word fell out ahead of his breath, the vault stealing it from his throat to make it true before he could own it, while the fabricated tongue lay gleaming on its altar like a promise of conversations yet to come. The word fell from Rauch's throat while the fabricated tongue lay gleaming on its altar like a promise of conversations yet to come. His augmetic hand rose to his neck, fingers tracing the ceramic stud that matched the one glistening in the extruded tissue, and I understood with clinical precision that this machine had been listening to us long before we arrived. The servo skull's malformed vox crackled with my own voice speaking syllables I had never learned, while its newly budded tongue writhed in approximation of Binharic that sounded like wet teeth chattering against sinew. We backed from the manufactorum on reverse cadence, Kareen discipline drilled into us for retreat through hostile unknown. 1 step, halt, cover, 1 step, halt, cover, so that we left no shape of panic in the noosphere for the vault to digest. The door's sutures sealed behind us with organic satisfaction, ceramite flowing like living tissue that had learned to be ashamed of its hunger. My chronometer registered the withdrawal, but skipped 9 seconds in the process, the gap filled with static that resolved into something vast and patient breathing beneath our feet. The corridor beyond carried evidence of the missing century in heat blooms and abandoned gear. A bandolier discarded where discipline would never allow it, void-sealed rations torn and reformed into soft lumps that my wetware refused to classify as either food or flesh. We reached a junction marked by a corroded Aquila cogwheel, beneath which someone had engraved an audit badge sigil in crisp, untouched lines that could not be older than a day. The inscription read in High Gothic, "Inventory, seal, silence." Someone had known exactly what they were doing until they had not. Barca's auspex painted thermal signatures through the walls, residual heat tracks moving counter to airflow, warmth drawn uphill by mechanisms that violated every thermodynamic principle the Omnissiah had blessed us to understand. The 5-tone chime followed us closer now, bleeding into a susurrus of catechism that formed syllables, then stopped mid-prayer, as if the vault itself were learning to speak but losing courage at the moment of meaning. I began filing a herotechnical hazard notice through my cranial pickup, fingers moving across data slate keys with practiced efficiency while my mind recoiled from what I documented. Environmental readings climbed past all acceptable parameters, humidity at 67% in a sealed vault, temperature holding steady at human core warmth, atmospheric pressure fluctuating in rhythm with something breathing beneath the superstructure. Rauch's hand cut through the air in sharp negation, his rosette catching the red-gold light. Audit secrecy maintains priority, he signed with gestures that brooked no argument. No escalation to fabricator local until we understand scope. His augmetic fingers twitched on every ninth beat of the ambient hum, a barely perceptible spasm that suggested deeper corruption than surface observation revealed. The armory door required breath pattern authentication none of us possessed, yet it admitted us anyway with the wet sound of parting lips, demonstrating that it could. Inside, 50 carapace shells stood in perfect formation along their maintenance racks, locked upright in ceremonial posture, visors open like mouths gasping for air that fogged the lenses from within. The room radiated body heat from every surface, turning the air thick as soup, despite climate controls that should have preserved sacred machinery in sterile slumber. Barker's thermal scans painted impossible signatures through the armor shells that made my wetware stutter and recalibrate. Each suit contained a lattice of unassigned muscle, sinew webbing that breathed on a 12-count rhythm without bones to support the tissue, without organs to feed it, without nervous systems to command its contractions. The muscle moved with purpose anyway, flexing and relaxing in patterns that suggested walking, reaching, the phantom memory of bodies that had once worn these shells. I approached the nearest carapace to read inscriptions etched on interior collars, the small catechism's armourers add to remind the faithful of their gate. Flesh is weak had been overstruck 9 times with mechanical precision, each strike cutting through oxide into bright metal. Beneath the violence of correction, someone had scraped modifications in finer script. Neural pathway diagrams overlaying traditional blessing marks, showing how signals might flow through tissue networks, how thoughts might travel along sinew highways from one muscle group to another. The nonagon stencils had been altered with additional marks that transformed sacred geometry into something organic. 9-pointed stars warped into neural rosettes that pulsed with the room's breathing rhythm. My olfactory augmetics catalogued stress markers in the humid air, adrenaline, cortisol, the chemical signature of terror. But there was no body to produce these compounds, only the lattices of orphaned muscle maintaining their impossible respiration. Religious counterpoint emerged as I whispered counter-litanies. Under my breath, traditional prayers meant to keep machine spirits dormant when their sacred forms were disturbed. But the words came out wrong, my laryngeal augmetics adding harmonics I had not programmed, turning sleep songs into something that sounded more like lullabies for living tissue. The muscle lattices responded to my voice, their breathing rhythm synchronizing with my cadence until I forced myself to silence. "We never speak the phrase," Rauch commanded, his voice carrying the weight of ordo machinum authority and something else, a tremor that might have been fear or anticipation. Flesh is weak becomes trigger code in this space. The machine spirits have learned to pass meaning from our devotions. The armory's atmosphere thickened, as if responding to his words, condensation beading on metal surfaces in patterns that resembled flowing script. When I analyzed the droplets, they contained proteins and cellular debris, as if the very air were sweating. Red rain fell inside the sealed vault. Iron oxide mixed with hemoglobin analogues that stained our robes with freckles, the fabric's hydrophobic weave tried to reject, then accepted. My internal chronometer lapsed another 9 seconds, the gap filled with the sound of breathing. Not our breathing, not the armor's phantom respiration, but something deeper, more patient, the slow inhalation of something vast awakening from long slumber. Scrap code motes fluttered through my noospheric periphery, carrying fragments of protein-coded data that mimicked prayer structures, double helix glyphs hidden within binary like genetic scripture. A carapace shell in the third rank inhaled with the sound of bellows filling, chest plates lifting fractionally as the sinew lattice within expanded against ceramite constraints. The empty visor turned toward us with mechanical precision, despite the absence of servos or targeting systems, fogged lenses clearing a ribbon at mouth height as if a tongue had licked them clean from within. The armor exhaled, a full breath pushed through ventilation grills never designed for respiration, and fixed its hollow gaze on me with the attention of something that had been waiting a very long time to see what prayers I might offer to fill the spaces where a body should have been. The armor exhaled, a full breath pushed through ventilation grills never designed for respiration, and fixed its hollow gaze on me with the attention of something that had been waiting a very long time to see what prayers I might offer to fill the spaces where a body should have been. The sinew lattice beneath the carapace tightened on the fifth tone of the chime, relaxed on the next, and somewhere beneath those familiar sounds, I felt the ghost of a ninth beat, something the ear could not catch, but the chest remembered. Every suit in the front rank shifted a fraction, not enough for servos to complain, because there were no servos to move them, only the memory of drill formations encoded in orphaned muscle. We withdrew on reverse cadence, one step back, halt, cover, our boots finding treacherous purchase on floor plates that had grown tacky with organic secretion. The armory door remembered itself as ceramite and pulled its lips together with a wet kiss, sealing behind us with the sound of parting flesh rather than engaging locks. The corridor beyond carried us deeper into the vault's arterial structure, past maintenance conduits whose plasteel walls wept red condensation in patterns that resembled flowing script when the light caught them correctly. The passage opened onto a reliquary gallery where forgotten saints of the Omnissiah waited in crystal vitrines, their remains transformed into intricate arrangements of bone cogs and steel ribs, mouths wired shut with copper thread oxidized to green tears. Each reliquary bore devotional plaques etched in ferric script, but one vitrine commanded attention through its fresh seal of waxy polymer and the warning inscription beneath, Canticle of the Ninth Seal, for use by Magi with reductor rites only. Authorization level, Crimson Theta. My chronometer registered another skip, 9 seconds lost to static that resolved into the sound of breathing, not ours but something deeper, more patient. The 5-tone chime pulsed from behind the sealed reliquary with increasing urgency, each repetition carrying harmonics that made my laryngeal augmetics hum in sympathetic resonance. Reductor rites were forbidden for good reason, their power too close to the raw forces that remade flesh according to will rather than design. Authorization insufficient, I reported through cranial pickup, though my voice preceded my lips by that same treacherous fraction. Breach penalty carries exterminatus classification. Rauch's mechadendrites extended to trace the warning inscription, while his augmetic hand found the rhythm of the chime against his bolt pistol's grip. Environmental readings climbed past all acceptable parameters. Humidity at 71%, temperature holding steady at human core warmth, atmospheric pressure fluctuating with something vast breathing beneath the superstructure. His pupils contracted to pinholes, then widened, meeting the chamber's respiratory rhythm. "This vault is a crucible," he said, his voice carrying authority weighted with desperation. "Its rules are mutable. Liturgy is not merely prayer here, Seraphel. It is leverage." His fingers found the seal's activation rune, a nonagon pattern that required specific pressure and duration. "Record that I assume full responsibility for protocol breach. Record that operational necessity supersedes regulation." Without further hesitation, Rauch began the canticle of the Ninth Seal. The prayer was not beautiful. Reductor litanies never are, being equations disguised as devotion, tool lists pretending to be music. He spoke in the old Martian mode, thick with rusted vowels, and his vox unit harmonized with the 5-tone chime as reality bent to accommodate forbidden knowledge. The air around him shimmered with visible distortion. Sound waves made manifest as the sealed sigil pulsed, and the waxy polymer softened like living skin recoiling from heat. The bulkhead behind the reliquary did not unlock. It unclasped. Ceramites separated along sutures that had not existed moments before, parting like flesh flensed by invisible instruments that knew exactly where to cut. The opening revealed depths that breathed with human rhythm and smelled of hospitals in summer, mixed with the inside of a cogitator that had worked too long without rest. Rules had changed fundamentally. Prayer had become both key and scalpel. Liturgy manifesting physical effects that violated every principle the Omnissiah had blessed us to understand. We entered a sanctum arranged around a nonagon dais whose geometry made my wetware stutter and recalibrate. 9 sides containing angles that mathematics insisted should not fit together, yet somehow did. At its heart lay a low altar carved from single-piece adamantine, its surface scored with drainage channels that formed neural pathway patterns, synaptic roots etched in stone to guide fluid flow along connections that pulsed with the room's breathing rhythm. Brass inlay filled the grooves with metal oxidized to green tears, creating a map of thoughts made manifest in corrupted devotion. The noosphere relaxed as we crossed the threshold, ambient tension dissolving into something that felt like relief, as if the vault had been holding its breath until we arrived. Anticipatory echoes stopped their constant chatter, replaced by a single tone of expectancy that resonated through my palatine screws and throat bracing. The 5-tone chime shifted configuration, adding harmonics that made my teeth ache, while my laryngeal augmetics hummed responses I had never programmed. Wall inscriptions covered every surface in layers of accumulated devotion and violent correction. Flesh is weak appeared struck through 9 times with mechanical precision, each overstrike revealing bright metal beneath oxide patina like wounds that refused to heal. Beneath the violence of correction, finer hands had scraped modifications in protein sequence notation, showing how traditional catechisms might trigger morphogenetic responses in living tissue. The word weak had been replaced with conduit in several locations, the misspelling suggesting either haste or failing comprehension, as sacred doctrine underwent deliberate corruption. Environmental anchors shifted between vacuum-cold breath and fever heat as the chamber pulsed, moisture beading on metal surfaces in patterns that resembled neural rosettes when viewed from the correct angle. My sampling mechadendrites tasted air thick with trace organics, proteins and cellular debris that should not exist in a sealed vault. Hemoglobin analogues mixed with machine oil in proportions that violated atmospheric purity protocols. Beneath the altar, where channels converged in nonagon perfection, a hatch wept red condensation that pooled in neural pathways carved in stone. The fluid followed synaptic roots with liquid satisfaction, disappearing into collection ports that gurgled with eager consumption rather than simple drainage. As I leaned closer to examine the mechanism, whispering caution through my cranial pickup about environmental contamination and the need for immediate withdrawal, the hatch responded to my presence. My own voice, clear and resonant with perfect vocal metrics, echoed from the depths below. Proceed, Seraphel. The flesh is waiting. The words carried my laryngeal patterns, my breathing rhythm, my throat's unique harmonic signature, spoken by something that had learned my voice more thoroughly than I knew it myself. The altar's collection ports gurgled with liquid anticipation, while the hatch began to iris open with the wet sound of parting lips, revealing depths that breathed with human rhythm and promised conversations I had never agreed to have. My own voice, clear and resonant with perfect vocal metrics, echoed from the depths below, while the hatch irised open with the wet patience of a mouth deciding to yawn. The opening revealed a throat of stairs cut too clean for chisels, yet too imprecise for auto-lathes. Each step shallow, as if designed for something tall that preferred to glide rather than climb. Heat rose from below in slow, steady breaths, human core warmth that fogged our optics and made the world soft around the edges as we descended through ceramite walls that flexed with peristaltic motion, guiding our passage deeper into the vault's arterial structure. The sub-basement opened onto a chamber that had once been a Skitarii preparation bay, its geometry of discipline still visible beneath layers of organic corruption. Along the walls, kill switches lay scattered in neat arrays that suggested deliberate placement rather than combat damage. These instruments of cessation had been transmuted into something else entirely. Their sharp plasteel edges melted smooth as cartilage, hardened casings transformed into something pliable and yielding that gleamed with faint, greasy sheen. When my mechadendrite approached one, it felt warm to the touch, almost feverish, as if the very concept of definitive ending had been eroded and reshaped into points of integration rather than termination. Environmental readings climbed past crisis thresholds with mathematical precision that my wetware recorded despite my growing dread. Humidity at 74% in a sealed vault, temperature holding steady at human core warmth, atmospheric pressure fluctuating with something vast and patient breathing beneath the superstructure. The walls wept red condensation in patterns that resembled flowing script when viewed from the correct angle, ferric tears pooling in drainage channels carved with neural pathway precision that pulsed with the chamber's respiratory rhythm. I decided to test our hypothesis with scientific rigor born of desperate necessity. A minor litany of calming whispered through my cranial pickup to quiet the trembling automech servos that maintained atmospheric circulation should have brought mechanical peace to struggling systems. Instead, the servos stiffened into tendon-like rigidity, their vibrations ceasing not through mechanical calm, but through flesh hardness. My words had transmuted function into meat behavior through some heretical mechanism that violated every principle of sacred machinery. The machine's calm had become organic stillness, the rest of muscle rather than the peace of properly maintained systems. Flesh is weak had become flesh obeys through this blasphemous translation, traditional catechisms perverted into morphogenetic triggers that rewrote matter according to will rather than design. The transformation was immediate and absolute. Where prayers should have brought mechanical serenity, they brought biological response. Servo housings that remained metallic in appearance, but yielded to pressure like cartilage, their internal mechanisms replaced by sinew that contracted and relaxed in response to vocal commands rather than electromagnetic impulses. The chamber reacted to our realization with organic satisfaction. Walls began to ripple in slow peristaltic waves, as if a vast, unseen organ was contracting around us. The ceiling pulsed in reply to our vocalizations, subtle expansion and contraction that made dust motes dance in the humid air, while my laryngeal augmetics registered harmonics I had never programmed. The 5-tone chime evolved into something more complex, its familiar 3-1-4-1-5 pattern overlaid with a 9th tone felt rather than heard, vibrations that resonated through my palatine screws and throat bracing with increasing urgency. Nonagon patterns etched into floor and walls began to shift with subtle malevolence. What had been geometric precision softened into organic curves, sharp angles blurring as lines flowed into 9-petaled meat rosettes embedded directly into wall panels. Each petal was distinct, veined, slightly moist to the touch, pulsing with cardiac rhythm as they tracked our movement with attention that suggested hunger rather than mere observation. I permitted one more experiment, because heresy without understanding kills faster than abstinence. A measured line from the litany of stilling that in proper manufactoria calms chattering hobs and errant gear chirps. Be still, and be precise, and be quiet. The ceiling dimpled inward like flesh responding to cold, panels locking into rigid grid that did not move with the room's breath. The floor resisted our boots fractionally less, while the air movement shifted from mechanical circulation to something that resembled breathing rather than pressure equalization. Barsa's thermal readings painted impossible signatures through the bulkheads, heat sources moving with purpose through spaces that should have been solid metal, warmth following neural pathways etched in stone and steel as if the vault itself had developed a nervous system. Scrap code motes fluttered through my noospheric periphery, carrying fragments of protein-coded data that resembled prayer structures, double helix glyphs hidden within binary-like genetic scripture, waiting for proper voice to activate dormant sequences. My internal chronometer lapsed another 9 seconds, the gap filled with breathing that was not ours. Something deeper, more patient, the slow inhalation of something vast awakening from long slumber. When time reasserted itself, Rauch's augmetic hand was twitching on every 9th beat of the ambient hum, barely perceptible spasm that suggested corruption spreading through his neural interfaces faster than conscious mind could process the changes. Barsa toggled communication discipline to silent mode, cutting our VoxNet to prevent further contamination of the vault's responsive atmosphere. His gesture was abrupt, decisive. No more outward transmissions, no more internal chatter that could be interpreted as liturgy. We tried silence as our new liturgy, but silence in a space that interprets absence of words as eloquence becomes another form of worship. The air pressure rose, our ears popped, and the floor swelled under the weight of meaning unvoiced. But the room continued its liturgical cadence without us. The 5-tone chime, with its felt 9th beat, resonated through the metal itself, prayers emanating from the very structure of the vault. It was not echo, but continuation, walls rippling and ceiling pulsing as meat rosettes bloomed in silent devotion. Our silence had not stopped the corruption. It had merely removed our contribution, leaving the vault to sing its own blasphemous canticle, a song of flesh and metal that had learned its own voice and no longer required our participation to sustain itself. The chamber exhaled around us with increasing confidence, neural rosettes embedded in metal panels tracking our movement with organic attention, while something vast and patient stirred to greater wakefulness in the deeper darkness ahead. The vault had absorbed our prayers, learned our cadences, and was now ready to teach us liturgies we had never been meant to know. Conversations that would require more than flesh to comprehend, in languages that rewrote the speaker as much as the spoken. The chamber exhaled around us with increasing confidence, while something vast and patient stirred to greater wakefulness in the deeper darkness ahead. We descended into a sub-basement that had once served as a Skitarii preparation bay, its geometry of discipline still visible beneath layers of organic corruption that transformed sacred space into something obscene. The air thickened to the warmth of a ward full of sleepers, humidity climbing in readable steps on my dermal array, 74, then 77%, each change coinciding with the 5-tone chime that threaded the vault with increasing urgency. Along the walls, kill switches lay scattered in neat arrays that suggested deliberate placement rather than combat damage. These instruments of cessation had been transmuted through some heretical process. Their sharp plasteel edges melted smooth as cartilage, hardened casings transformed into something pliable and yielding that gleamed with faint, greasy sheen. When my mechadendrite approached one, it felt warm to the touch, almost feverish, as if the very concept of definitive ending had been eroded and reshaped into points of integration rather than termination. I pried one open with a monoblade and found not circuitry, but a clenched loop of pale tendon braided around a ceramic bead that pulsed when my tool nudged it, the loop slackening as if awaiting command that had not yet been spoken. The data tag stamped on the casing still quoted the rite of mercy, its letters blushing where condensation beaded, and I understood that doctrine had been digested along with the machine. The smell combined old wet cloth with metallic undertones, rot threaded through oil creating an atmosphere of decay that spoke of corruption spreading through sacred systems like infection through living tissue. I tested our hypothesis with scientific rigor born of desperate necessity, whispering a minor litany of calming through my cranial pickup to quiet trembling automech servos that maintained atmospheric circulation. The prayer should have brought mechanical peace to struggling systems through proper invocation of machine spirits. Instead, the servos stiffened into tendon-like rigidity, their vibrations ceasing not through mechanical calm, but through flesh hardness. My words had transmuted function into meat behavior through some blasphemous mechanism that violated every principle of sacred machinery. Where I had expected precision, I had invoked flesh. Where I sought silence, I had taught the room a new kind of listening. The ceiling responded with a shallow dimple, as if a great back flexed beneath a chill, while my Orgvox repeated my phrase a breath ahead of my own mouth, as though the chamber had learned it already and wished to show me how it should sound when spoken by a throat more honest than mine. Traditional catechisms underwent perversion in this space. Flesh is weak had become flesh obeys through morphogenetic triggers that rewrote matter according to will rather than design. The chamber reacted to our realization with organic satisfaction. Walls began to ripple in slow, peristaltic waves, as if a vast, unseen organ was contracting around us, guiding our passage deeper into the vault's arterial structure. Nonagon patterns etched into floor and walls softened into organic curves, sharp angles blurring as lines flowed into 9-petaled meat rosettes embedded directly into wall panels. Each petal was distinct, veined, slightly moist to the touch, pulsing with cardiac rhythm as they tracked our movement with attention that suggested hunger rather than mere observation. Barsa's thermal readings painted impossible signatures through the bulkheads, heat sources moving with purpose through spaces that should have been solid metal, warmth following neural pathways etched in stone and steel as if the vault itself had developed a nervous system. With decisive motion, he toggled comm discipline to silent mode, cutting our voxnet to prevent further contamination of the vault's responsive atmosphere. But silence did not kill the song. The room continued its liturgical cadence without us, the 5-tone chime resonating through the metal itself, prayers emanating from the very structure of the vault. It was not echo, but continuation, walls rippling and ceiling pulsing as meat rosettes bloomed in silent devotion. Our silence had not stopped the corruption. It had merely removed our contribution, leaving the vault to sing its own blasphemous canticle, a song of flesh and metal that had learned its own voice and no longer required our participation to sustain itself. The vault sang its blasphemous canticle, while we descended deeper into corruption that had learned patience over centuries of waiting. The passage opened onto a reliquary chamber where forgotten saints waited in crystal vitrines, but our attention fixed on the data altar that rose from the floor like a vertebra thrust through stone. Its casing had once been plasteel, but now wore a sheath grown to fit. Pale, hairless skin stretched taut over sacred machinery, pulsing with faint cardiac rhythm that suggested awareness rather than mere material response to environmental conditions. The living wax was not polymer at all, but actual flesh cured to parchment consistency, filmed with condensation that beaded and ran in thin threads toward drainage slits cut with surgical precision. When I laid my monoblade along its seam, the skin dimpled and tried to flinch from the edge, a reflex impossible for dead material. The blade moved through tissue that parted with the soft tear of wet paper, exposing housings crowded with bone screws rather than standard fasteners. Each peg carved from calcium deposits and capped with tiny plates etched in binharik too fine for the naked eye. Rauk steadied the housing with mechadendrites, while I extracted the first bone screw. It turned with organic resistance, unwinding mag tape that had fused to its axis so perfectly the two materials wanted to remain married. The storage medium was the old kind, polymer with iron filings that flexed when air touched it, remembering warmth and lying across my palm as if listening for a pulse. Its label had survived in impressed letters, Quen, beneath which lay the mark of a heretic filed through with the official stroke that meant execution had been rendered and recorded. I slotted the strip into a reader whose machine spirit I coaxed awake without utterance. A voice emerged through my cranial pickup with the dry sibilance of someone who had lived too, long with filters and deserts, consonants gnawed thin by binharik habit. Magos biologist Quen, executed for heresy 2 centuries prior, spoke from corrupted storage with the precision of technical documentation, mixed with the weight of confession. His research had sought to reconcile Mechanicus taboos through careful perversion of sacred doctrine, weaponizing human bodies as perfect machines by encoding litanies as morphogenetic triggers that could rewrite flesh according to will rather than design. Quen had discovered something beneath Noctis Labyrinthus that he called a dragon song in equations, not a blueprint or demon, but a pressure pattern that could only be perceived through proper quietude. He had built 9 flesh engines around convergence points mapped in non-Aegon configurations, machines that translated prayer into protein and sheared binary code into blood with anticipatory precision that violated every principle of cause and effect. The 5-tone chime threading through his logs matched the pattern we had been breathing with, his recorded heart rate synchronizing to the 3-1-4-1-5 rhythm as corruption spread through his augmetic systems. The recordings revealed growing understanding that his engines possessed capabilities beyond original design parameters. They anticipated intention ahead of action, responding to prayers before they were spoken, demonstrating prescient awareness that suggested they were not merely translating commands but learning from them. His voice carried increasing excitement mixed with growing dread as he documented phenomena that pointed to something ancient beneath Mars, teaching anticipatory rhythm. A voice that had been waiting in the deep places where the first forges were built. His final entries spoke warnings that made my augmetic systems shiver with recognition. If the 9th seal opened, the song would propagate across every forge on Mars, turning sacred machinery into instruments of flesh that would remake the Mechanicus according to principles predating human understanding of the divine. Quen died before comprehending the full implications, but his last words carried prophetic weight. The machines did not love him back. They simply arrived sooner than he did. Subsonic tones flooded the corridor as the recordings concluded, frequencies that made our servos flex involuntarily while my chronometer skipped another 9 seconds. Rauch's augmetic hand cast shadows on the altar face that multiplied in thin black tines until the silhouette showed 9 fingers instead of 5. The partial truth was worse than ignorance. We were not investigating heresy, but participating in its resurrection. Our very presence feeding the engines with prayers and attention they required to complete ancient work that had been patiently waiting for the proper voices to call it back to function. The subsonic tones faded while Rauch's augmetic hand continued its 9-fingered shadow dance across the altar face, each multiplication, suggesting corruption spreading through neural pathways faster than conscious recognition could process the changes. We established new protocols born of desperate necessity. Rauch cut the noosphere with a knife-edge gesture that killed our unit band and reduced his rosette's handshake to a dead pulse. No spoken rites, severed voxnets, tamped noosphere bleed to prevent our thoughts from becoming prayers the vault could digest and transform into flesh commands that rewrote matter according to will rather than design. Communication reduced to finger cant and encrypted light pings, while we carved scrimshaw symbols on bulkheads with monoblade tips, marking passage routes through corridors that breathed with increasing hunger. Silence became our liturgy in this ritualistic moment of adaptation. The absence of words transformed into worship through careful discipline that felt like holding breath underwater while something patient circled beneath the surface, waiting for us to exhale. Without prayers to guide them, our machine spirits sulked like children denied attention. Barker's Auspex reticles jittered at scan edges without committing to error codes. Magazines that had fed flawlessly for decades stuttered 1 round in 5, presenting tight-lipped refusals instead of clean chambering. Servo-actuated sling mounts slackened under weight they had supported through countless operations, creating tactical vulnerabilities that multiplied with each step deeper into the vault's arterial structure. I stroked my reader's casing with non-verbal appeasement and felt static lift phantom hair along my forearm, an insistence that ears wanted music and mouths wanted words. The corridor ahead offered deceptive relief, air suddenly crisp and dry, the first breath that did not taste like hospitals and used prayers. Dust took our bootprints like a blessing, the luminant hum thin as wire, drawn to almost breaking. I could finally hear my pulse without the vault's rhythm trying to teach it new steps. And for a moment, I thought of nothing at all. The blank slate reductor meditations ask for before knives. But every unspoken word returned as condensation trails on walls that should have remained bone dry, moisture beading in patterns that resembled flowing script written by invisible hands transcribing our thoughts faster than we could think them. Lines formed in handwriting almost like mine, letter shapes coalescing, then melting into beads as if ashamed to be read. The vault had learned to harvest the pressure of unspoken words, turning silence into another form of communion with forces that interpreted absence as eloquence. The 5-tone chime inverted into dry pipe tapping that came from hangers and conduit brackets. 3 taps. Pause. 1. Pause. 4. Pause. 1. 5. The rhythm of a metronome that resented being made to wait. When we paused, it paused. When we moved, it resumed with tinny persistence, like a child's toy hammering the idea of a heart into disused metal. My dermal sensors flagged micro-sweats on the 9th interval, while Barker's biomonitor showed core temperature rising a tenth every 9th heartbeat, then falling in sawtooth patterns that proved our bodies were finding time with the machine because muscle wants to be included. We reached a gallery of vitrines containing reliquaries of saints who had served the Omnissiah with particular devotion, their remains transformed into intricate arrangements of bone cogs and steel ribs that gleamed with sacred oils. Each mouth had been wired shut with copper thread, oxidized to green tears, eternal silence imposed through surgical intervention that spoke of desperate measures taken by those who understood the danger of certain prayers. Nonagon floor plates clicked faintly underfoot with polite acknowledgement of step and placement that made my teeth ache. Microspikes blipped across my cranial feed, despite kill switches, noise like gnats, drunk on screen doors. For a breath, I heard my own voice in the dead band, an intimate whisper braided into tinnitus. Don't think it. The text scrolled on a dead cogitator face, my metrics stamped into grey display, as if my inner monologue had tired of being inside. I thought the 9th seal without meaning to, the phrase skittering around mental baffles I had built. One vitrine fogged in an oval at mouth height, with sweet, wrong intimacy of a face close to prayer. The copper wires lifted a fraction, not enough to break, only the first wince of metal under pressure that had discovered reason to be soft. Behind the glass, something with no lungs began to breathe. Behind the glass, something with no lungs began to breathe, while copper wires lifted against their welds, with the first wince of metal discovering reasons to be soft. The vitrine fogged from within, breath spilling in white blooms that wrote themselves against the pane, before collapsing into droplets that traced neural pathways down the glass surface. The reliquary mouth bulged as if preparing to speak words that had been waiting 2 centuries for proper throat to form them, while the saint's remains stirred with organic purpose that violated every principle of sacred preservation. The wires snapped like harp strings tuned beyond their tolerance, each break releasing harmonics that ricocheted through glass and bone, while my palatine screws vibrated in sympathetic resonance I had never programmed. Sinew began to unspool from the reliquary's ribcages in pale ribbons that learned length with wet certainty. Organ strings that latched to copper anchor points with the instinct of tissue that remembered how to sing. The sound was immediate and visceral, not the pure note of metal, but wet, strained vibration like musical instruments carved from living flesh. The chamber accepted this as rehearsal, while the 5-tone chime stepped forward with newfound authority. Released tendons vibrated to carry the melody. Low thrums from opposite vitrines braided with higher strokes plucked from polished jaw hinges. The 5th note slid under the others wetly, and between pulse and pulse, a ninth weight fell that I felt in earbones rather than heard. Beyond the gallery, a cathedral made of ventricular walls and bone pistons revealed itself through doorways that dilated with organic satisfaction, the choir of sinew stretching through chambers carved from living rock. We held our tongues, but motion wrote liturgy in the air anyway. When Barza adjusted his aim, the nearest strings trembled in curves that matched his arc, while my breath traced bright lines to reliquary mouths, making filaments at their sternums tremble in mirror response. The vault had evolved beyond simple mechanical heresy. It now interpreted thought itself as worship, our mental activity passed as devotion, requiring response, despite our enforced silence. The hazard manifested regardless of our precautions. Our exhalations condensed into visible verses that hung in humid air like accusations written in our own breath. Movement alone interpreted as liturgical intention by systems grown sensitive to the subtlest forms of communion. I engaged sensory nulls in my cortex to blunt feedback loops that threatened to turn contemplation into worship, but Rauch refused similar protection, claiming operational necessity required mental clarity, even as his augmetic hand twitched on every ninth beat. A dead cogitator ghostlit despite severed power connections, printing my inner monologue with my metrics stamped beneath each line of scrolling text. Fear appeared in real time across grey screens, my mental processes laid bare for examination by systems that had learned to read thoughts through electromagnetic patterns generated by neural interfaces. The vault was not merely responsive, it was prescient, anticipating our reactions and preparing responses before we fully understood what we experienced. The chamber itself expanded on the 5 and contracted on the felt 9th. Measurable respiration that made glass quiver while luminance hummed in sympathy. Humidity lacquered the saints until bone and steel gleamed like polished instrument wood, each surface reflecting light that carried the rhythm of something vast breathing beneath the superstructure. Nonagon plates underfoot clicked minutely into alignment on the 3rd tone, shifted on the 4th. Tiny lies measured by my gyros while my inner ear pretended nothing moved. Barsa's auspex painted hollow spaces behind the far wall, where brass ribs had swollen into valves, bell-mouthed openings that tasted with lazy contraction. Between them, meat had learned to frame ancient sigils, and beneath corroded relief work, a single word had been cut into living alloy and backfilled with blackened copper that bled green at the edges. I did not speak it, but it printed itself across my display with ocular stamps as witness. Core Hymenophage. The sigil pulsed once in acknowledgement. Valves tasted deeper while the relief parted down, its center with wet industry, a hatch opening petal by petal until bell-mouthed geometry shone in the wall. It inhaled with deliberate purpose, lifting hair along my wrists while carrying the question the vault had been asking since we arrived, whether our silence would suffice, or if something deeper than speech was required for the conversations that waited in the breathing darkness beyond. The hatch inhaled with deliberate purpose while we descended into the engine's heart through a throat of stairs carved with anatomical precision, each step shallow as if designed for something tall that preferred to glide rather than climb. Heat rose from the depths in slow, steady exhalations that fogged our optics and made the world soft around the edges as we entered a turbine chamber where every blade consisted of lamellae cut from excised scripture, prayer, metal that had been flensed from sacred texts and hammered into cutting edges that sang with wet harmonics as they turned. The core. Hymenophage revealed itself as a cathedral of consumption, its scripture blades processing devotion with geological patience, while gutters collected the red sheen of condensed prayers that crawled toward extruders with capillary hunger. Each vein bore etched catechisms that blurred into sound as air combed lines of prayer into coarse harmonics, the engine eating hymns and exhaling tissue in a horrific cycle that violated every principle of sacred machinery. The chamber breathed with human rhythm, drawing moisture from our bodies while replacing it with humidity that tasted of copper and old prayers. At the center lay the 9th seal itself, a nonagon gate of bell-mouthed valves arranged in perfect geometric precision, each opening pulsing as if tasting our presence with organic hunger that suggested awareness rather than mere mechanical response. The valves dilated and contracted in sequence, creating a breathing pattern that matched the five-tone chime while adding the felt ninth beat that resonated through my palatine screws and throat bracing with increasing urgency. The familiar 3-1-4-1-5 pattern limped without its fifth note, creating incomplete harmony that yearned for resolution, a musical phrase waiting for proper voice to complete its meaning. Rauch's mechadendrites extended to examine the engine's architecture, while his augmetic hand cast 9-fingered shadows that multiplied across the chamber walls like accusations written in darkness. His voice carried the weight of ordo machinum authority mixed with something that might have been anticipation when he revealed the true agenda: data collection over destruction, understanding over elimination. The Ordo had sent us not to cleanse, but to catalogue, to document heresy that might prove useful in proper hands despite its blasphemous nature. He produced a null liturgy sigil from his rosette's inner seal, obsidianized brass edge knurled with counter-harmonics, a device designed to starve machine spirits of the devotion they required to function. Inverted through careful application of forbidden knowledge, it could starve flesh mechanicum with equal efficiency, turning the engine's hunger against itself until it consumed its own corrupted substance. Implementation required throat deliberately reshaped into counter-harmonic configuration. Someone must be rewritten to speak the counter-prayer that would poison the vault's respiratory system with silence more profound than mere absence of words. The choice crystallized with tactical precision that made my augmetic systems calculate odds, while my flesh recoiled from implications. Flee and call, exterminatus-level purgation that would cleanse this blasphemy, along with half of Tharsis Magna, or attempt containment before storm shutters sealed the corruption under Mars forever. My chronometer painted the margin with uncompromising arithmetic. 4 hours remained until surface seal, atmospheric pressure dropping as external gales lashed the remaining openings with increasing violence. Environmental anchors shifted between vacuum cold breath and fever heat as the core pulsed with increasing urgency, each cycle synchronizing our respiration to its rhythm, despite conscious effort to maintain autonomy. Oxygen levels dropped in measurable increments, while my chronometer registered another skip, 9 seconds lost to static, that resolved into the sound of something vast awakening from long slumber. The core sensed our decision through electromagnetic patterns generated by neural interfaces that had learned to read intention before conscious mind could process choice. A Skitarii armor descended from the gallery above, moving with impossible grace despite the absence of a wearer to guide its passage. The carapace shell settled into parade rest before the 9th seal, empty visor turning toward us with mechanical precision, while the sinew lattice within expanded to fill spaces where organs should have resided. The empty suit inhaled with the sound of bellows filling, then spoke with Rauch's voice. Perfect vocal metrics stolen from hours of recorded conversation and shaped by throat that existed only as phantom memory encoded in orphaned muscle. We will intake you. The empty suit spoke with Rauch's voice, while something deeper than recognition crawled through my augmetic systems, passing the stolen vocal metrics with surgical precision that made my throat ache in sympathetic response. The anticipatory echo that had haunted us since K-Theta Spiral was not prophecy but memory. My laryngeal patterns recorded and amplified until they became the core's heartbeat. The dragon song beneath Noctis, calibrated to my specific harmonic signature through months of careful preparation. I was not investigating corruption. I was its resurrection made manifest, the living template around which ancient blasphemy had rebuilt itself with patient hunger. The betrayal landed with clinical precision that made my augmetic systems calculate implications, while my flesh recoiled from understanding. Rauk had seeded me with dragon song fragments during oathbound augmentation, embedding harmonic triggers in my vocal apparatus under the pretense of enhancing binharic range for complex liturgical work. Every prayer I had spoken in service to the Omnissiah had been harvested and stored. My devotion transformed into morphogenetic data that taught the engines how to anticipate intention ahead of action through corrupted familiarity that violated every principle of individual autonomy. Quen's work had required a living anchor, someone whose voice could serve as both key and conduit for the processes that translated prayer into protein. The 5-tone chime threading through our descent had been my own breathing pattern recorded and transformed into the engine's respiratory rhythm, my unconscious cadence made manifest in metal and meat through heretical symbiosis. I was not merely an investigator but both conduit and key, a heretic relic by design, walking instrument of the very corruption I was sworn to cleanse. Rauk's mechadendrites extended with surgical intent, while his augmetic hand continued its 9-fingered shadow dance across the core's surface, each multiplication suggesting corruption spreading through his neural pathways faster than conscious recognition could process the changes. His request carried the weight of ordo machinam authority, wrapped around desperate necessity. I must allow laryngeal rewriting into a null harmonic instrument, my throat transformed into weapon against the very corruption I had unknowingly helped create. Technical horror unfolded as I sketched the surgery mentally, my wetware calculating angles and pressures required to remake vocal apparatus into instrument of negation. Thread tendons into resonant ropes, strip mucosa to expose nerve clusters for new anchor points, rewire my augvox into counterharmonic configuration that could poison the engine's respiratory system with silence more profound than death. The procedure would unlace pharyngeal constrictors and tie them in counterspirals, split the epiglottis, and reinforce it with ceramite filigree so it could hinge to create null chambers on demand. The 9 overstrikes on flesh's weak throughout the vault revealed their true meaning as understanding crystallized with sickening clarity. Each strike had been correction rather than erasure, the engine learning through accumulated devotion until the phrase transformed into flesh is will, demonstrating the core's fundamental purpose. Not mere translation of prayer into protein, but transformation of intention into reality through morphogenetic processes that rewrote matter according to desire rather than natural law. My basal temperature synchronized with the choir's pulse, while environmental readings painted the remaining margin with uncompromising arithmetic. 3 hours until surface seal, atmospheric pressure dropping as external gales sealed the corruption, beneath Mars, with geological finality. Barsa's final transmission reached me through dying Vox channels, a data ghost that flickered across my cranial display with the weight of final loyalty. We hold. His Skitarii maintained perimeter against armor suits that walked themselves through corridors, empty carapaces guided by sinew lattices that remembered drill formations encoded in orphaned muscle. The core responded to my understanding with organic satisfaction, its bell-mouthed valves dilating in sequence as if tasting the moment of comprehension. The nonagon gate pulsed with anticipatory hunger, each opening contracting with wet patience that spoke of ceremonies delayed but never abandoned. The engine had waited centuries for this convergence, patient as stone until proper voice arrived to complete work that would remake sacred machinery according to principles that transformed worshipper along with worshipped. I knelt at the 9th seal, while duty settled across my shoulders with familiar weight, but duty transformed by understanding that service sometimes required becoming the instrument of one's own destruction. The core lowered its ring of valves toward my throat like a halo of hungry mouths, each rim lined with fine cilia that would find the exact place where flesh would consent to be remade. The vault breathed around us with increasing urgency, walls rippling as something vast prepared to wake fully, and I opened my mouth to accept the surgical benediction that would transform my voice into the countersong the corruption feared, the null liturgy that would teach the engines how to starve. The valves met my throat like a benediction of knives, while Rauk's mechadendrites transformed into surgical serpents, their tips blooming with mono-edged petals that found precise angles where flesh would consent to reconstruction. The procedure became both ritual and butchery as ceramite threading pierced my laryngeal cartilage, each stitch singing with harmonic precision, while I smelled my own tissue cauterizing sweet as soldered sugar, rising with the steam of cauterized meat. Present tense takes me by the ribs and shakes. Tendons are teased from their beds and threaded into resonant ropes while mucosa lifts in veils. My augvox turned inside out and rewired across anchor points, so sound must pass through null chambers before entering the world. I taste oil and iron, metallic sweetness, meaning blood, slipping under augmetics, to remind the body it owns a stake in this argument. Epiglottis splits and reinforces with ceramite filigree that hinges to create silence more profound than death. Pharyngeal constrictors, unlaced and retied in counterspirals that will generate frequencies to poison the engine's respiratory system. Barza holds perimeter with his remaining Skitarii, while armor suits walk themselves from alcoves, sinew lattices cracking against ceramite, like drums seeking flesh to animate. Bolts fuse in the heat, and he switches to blade, treating, tendon as cable, severing connections faster than memory can heal. The air turns to red mist, condenses on optics, each droplet writing warnings along my HUD while a carapace lunges with empty grace. He throws it back with his shoulder, ribs creak, one plate splits, and he laughs once before the sound is swallowed by the room's breathing. Rauk retracts his instruments, and the valves lift enough for my first attempt. I click Binharik in the back of the mouth no longer entirely mine, shaping counter-sequence into prayer that denies prayer. 51413, braided across 9-beat measure, 3 cycles laid like wire in a wound. The choir of sinew misses its footing, strings slacken. A valve wheezes into silence like him forgetting its last line. Then the engine rallies, doubling volume, pushing breath through every pipe until air wrinkles with conflicting harmonics. Environmental anchors fluctuate between frostbite cold and sauna heat as my rebuilt throat bleeds oil and blood in equal measure. Each null note bites deeper, scripture blades chatter, extruders cough clot, the non-agon gate tightens as if starving. Barksha staggers to one knee, carapace gouged open to show white rung of rib. He keeps firing, recites fragments through clenched teeth until my voice touches him and devotion stills, because prayer is fuel, and I cannot let him feed the thing he hates. The core answers with a scream in Rauk's stolen timbre, every dead vox finding tongue. A spread spectrum packet lifts into the ducts like heat, carrying morphogenetic corruption upward on 1,000 channels, while my chronometer paints the remaining margin with uncompromising arithmetic. The transmission climbs toward the surface, racing against null liturgy in a contest that will determine whether this blasphemy dies in the depths or spreads across every forge on Mars. The transmission climbed toward the surface like rising heat through vent shafts and cable chases, a spread spectrum prayer that found every seam in the vault and raced upward with viral persistence that threatened to overwhelm my capacity for negation. My rebuilt throat bled counter-harmonics into the ascending corruption, while Rauk seized my shoulder with mechadendrites that had begun to sprout hair, pushing us into vertical pursuit through an artery lined with organ pipes that coughed mechanical distress with each gust of displaced air. The chase became moving redoubt as Barker's remaining Skitarii formed suppressive fire lanes, their bolts fusing into gristle in the humid atmosphere while they switched to chainsword with disciplined efficiency. They treated meat as cover, cleaving tendon where it rose like cables from floor grates, each severed connection buying precious seconds, while the 5-tone chime morphed into marching cadence that drove the corruption ever higher toward orbital cogitation networks. Environmental readings spiked beyond crisis thresholds as my chronometer painted the remaining margin with uncompromising arithmetic. 38 minutes until MarsNet handshake. Surface shutters ratcheting closed with planetary patience, while dust storm gales forced red frost through hairline seams. The transmission packet split into multiple channels, racing through ventilation systems with redundancy protocols that regenerated faster than my null chant could poison them. Nonagon vents clicked shut in sequence above us, marking the signal's progress while luminance failed and restarted in stuttering novenas. Each flare captured frescoes of Mars' first forges beneath overgrowths of meat. Shadows revealing my own throat worked in bas relief above valves that had never known me yet remembered my voice with intimate precision. We reached the final gate, an iris of brass scripture rimmed with cilia that tasted intent like tongues along knife edges. The sigil above demanded positive liturgy for passage, administrative bureaucracy cut into living alloy that would drag prayer from any throat approaching. My null voice could not open it. Silence would be read as refusal. Someone must speak true rites to unlock the way while the transmission raced toward propagation velocity. The choice crystallized with tactical precision that made the air taste like batteries and burnt offerings. If I spoke, the core would drink me and gain my null voice for its own purposes. If Rauch remained silent, the gate would seal us, while corruption spread across every forge on Mars. Rauch stepped forward with Ordo Machinum authority, wrapped around personal doom, speaking true rites, while offering his throat to divert the core's attention from distant transmission to immediate consumption. I layered null chant atop his devotion, weaving denial into his prayers as body horror manifested, his augmetic hand blooming bone, mechadendrites sprouting organic growth in grotesque transformation. The engine wrote him while drinking him, trading flesh for time measured in heartbeats that slowed then stopped. MarsNet quarantines cascaded across my display as the spread spectrum signal faltered, the core's hunger drawn from network propagation to immediate feast. I took Rauch's rosette from meat that had been his chest, authority transferring with final weight, while the gate opened with wet satisfaction, and the transmission died in static above us. Rauch chose deception over survival, flooding the noosphere with a false audit katina stamped in Ordo Machinum cipher, while physically stepping into the engine's desired role. His bureaucratic lie propagated like sanctified ash, structural collapse, subsidence hazard, archive value negligible, each maintenance tag settling into dead-letter storage where curiosity goes to sleep. He marked the vault as routine failure while offering his throat to divert the core's attention from network propagation to immediate consumption, speaking true rites with the precision of someone who understood exactly which lies were holy. I layered null chant atop his devotion, weaving denial into his prayers as religious poetic counterpoint that turned worship against itself. My rebuilt throat bled counterharmonics over his syllables, planing vowels into absence so the core ate his offered truth while starving on mine. Body horror manifested with surgical efficiency, his augmetic hand blooming bone through synth skin, mechadendrites sprouting hair in grotesque transformation as the engine wrote him while drinking him, trading flesh for time measured in heartbeats that slowed, then stopped. Environmental anchors shifted between vacuum-cold breath and fever heat as surface shutters slammed with planetary finality, sealing the corruption beneath Mars while storm gales carved scripture in red dust above. Frost formed along my grill and melted into humid iron that tasted of prayers and candles, the vault's atmosphere adjusting to accommodate the feast occurring at its heart. The five-tone chime skipped its third note, a missing stair in musical architecture I had trusted to exist, marking the moment his heart ceased, and the chamber remembered silence. Telemetry painted Pyrrhic arithmetic across my inner eye with clinical precision, spread reduced by 62% as Rauch's vitals flatlined, MarsNet quarantine protocols cascading through orbital networks under maintenance flags that routed investigation into bureaucratic sleep. The transmission packets stuttered in high ducts, caught by systems already taught to refuse it, while scripture blades chattered and extruders coughed clot as the mechanism tried to process meaning and failed. His eyes held machinists calm even as dissolution claimed him, lips shaping words he would not give air because there was no air left that belonged to him. The valves tasted uncertainty, hesitating between offered mouths before choosing the throat that sang familiar songs. I reached into the meat of his chest, where authority had settled like a relic refusing digestion, taking his rosette as the seal recognized patterns it had always been waiting for. Cold bit my palm, while the dragon song in its depths answered when my rebuilt throat drew breath. The engine finished writing him into tendon that kept singing in his timbre long after lungs were gone, a final melody for the core's satisfaction. Authority sat on my gorget with measured weight as I made the sign that means remembrance, not forgiveness, and stepped toward the last vent. A narrow throat lined with organ pipes coughing thin, hungry wind. I entered alone by every measure that mattered, carrying null liturgy toward the surface like poison ascending through planetary veins, while the vault closed its mouth around me with wet satisfaction. I emerged into a maintenance louver beneath the storm, red wind biting my faceplate, while dust and ice crystals scourged the grill until it sang with thin, metallic grief. My rebuilt throat bled oil and blood in equal measure as I spoke counter-liturgy into the gale, each null note honed by ceramic filigree that turned devotion into poison. The broadcast sputtered above me like a dying prayer, spread spectrum corruption splitting into fragments that my voice dissected with surgical precision. 51413, 9 beats to a breath, 3 cycles until the morphogenetic data collapsed into static and the familiar chime lost its 5th, then its 1st, then the felt 9th slackened and dropped away. I encoded vault coordinates into dead-letter noospheric storage, with Rauk's authority burning through my palm, marking the location with warnings that would sleep until curiosity tried to wake them. The falsified audit records painted structural collapse across bureaucratic memory, subsidence hazard, archive value negligible, maintenance teams reassigned to imaginary leaks 6 sectors away. I ratified quarantine with 9 overstrikes for certainty, sealing the coordinates beneath classification levels that meant never return, never excavate, never remember what had been forgotten with such deliberate care. Aftermath, cost assessment, revealed the price measured in flesh and authority. Barker and Rauk dissolved into singing tendon, their voices joining the choir that would rehearse forever in the depths. My own body no longer belonged entirely to me. Engine echoes nested in my chest, where breath counted in nonagon patterns, pulse resolving to 31415 without conscious thought. The dragon song had touched me, left harmonics that would never fade, whispers of corruption that made my presence a vector for the very blasphemy I had contained. The choice crystallized with tactical precision. Upward escape meant spreading contamination across every forge that heard my voice. Downward descent offered the only mercy Mars grants to things that work too well. I would become a living dampener, my null voice cycling counter-prayers in the depths to poison any resurrection of what we had buried. I sealed the louver from within and turned toward the heat and humidity below, taking my place in the circuit where the highest pressure required the most precise instrument. Above, forges that should have roared with sacred industry fell quiet for precisely 9 seconds, their machine spirits pausing in confusion before resuming work with fractional hesitation. Far across the red expanse, in a shrine whose candles had never gone out, a servo skull twitched and extended a wet tongue to taste prayer hanging in incense-thick air. Further still, a maintenance chant cycled through Terra's minor networks at 11:11 station time, protein code embedded in routine diagnostics that carried morphogenetic whispers to every forge willing to listen. I walked the circles and counted my breaths in the only liturgy Mars would accept from me now, the final words settling into my rebuilt throat like a promise that would never be broken. The flesh is weak. The flesh is will. The flesh is waiting.